Preface to Chapter 5 of Einhard's Life of Charlemagne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Einhard's Life of Charlemagne. Preface to Chapter 5. Einhard's Preface. Since I had taken upon myself to narrate the public and private life, and no small part of the deeds of my lord and foster-father, the most lent and most justly renowned King Charles, I have condensed the matter into as brief a form as possible. I have been careful not to omit any facts that could come to my knowledge, but at the same time not to offend by a prolix style those minds that despise everything modern, if one can possibly avoid offending, by a new work, men who seem to despise also the masterpieces of antiquity, the works of most learned and luminous writers. Very many of them, I have no doubt, are men devoted to a life of literary leisure, who feel that the affairs of the present generation ought not to be passed by, and who do not consider everything done today as unworthy of mention, and deserving to be given over to silence and oblivion, but are nevertheless seduced by lust of immortality to celebrate the glorious deeds of other times by some sort of composition, rather than to deprive posterity of the mention of their own names by not writing at all. Be this as it may, I see no reason why I should refrain from entering upon a task of this kind, since no man can write with more accuracy than I of events that took place about me, and of facts concerning which I had personal knowledge, ocular demonstration, as the saying goes, and I have no means of ascertaining whether or not any one else has the subject in hand. In any event, I would rather commit my story to writing, and hand it down to posterity in partnership with others, so to speak, than to suffer the most glorious life of this most excellent king, the greatest of all the princes of his day, and his illustrious deeds, hard for men of later times to imitate, to be wrapped in the darkness of oblivion. But there are still other reasons, neither unwarrantable nor insufficient, in my opinion, that urge me to write on this subject, namely, the care that King Charles bestowed upon me in my childhood, and my constant friendship with himself and his children after I took up my abode at court. In this way he strongly endeared me to himself, and made me greatly his debtor as well in death as in life, so that, were I unmindful of the benefits conferred upon me, to keep silence concerning the most glorious and illustrious deeds of a man who claims so much at my hands, and suffer his life to lack due eulogy and written memorial, as if he had never lived, I should deservedly appear ungrateful, and be so considered, albeit my powers are feeble, scanty, next to nothing indeed, and not at all adapted to write and set forth a life that would tax the eloquence of a Tully. Note: Tully is Marcus Tullius Cicero. I submit the book. It contains the history of a very great and distinguished man, but there is nothing in it to wonder at besides his deeds, except the fact that I, who am a barbarian, and very little versed in the Roman language, seem to suppose myself capable of writing gracefully and respectably in Latin, and to carry my presumption so far as to disdain the sentiment that Cicero is said in the first book of the Tusculan Disputations to have expressed when speaking of the Latin authors. His words are, "It is an outrageous abuse both of time and literature for a man to commit his thoughts to writing without having the ability either to arrange them or elucidate them, or attract readers by some charm of style." This dictum of the famous orator might have deterred me from writing, if I had not made up my mind that it was better to risk the opinions of the world, and put my little talents for composition to the test, than to slight the memory of so great a man for the sake of sparing myself. The Life of the Emperor Charles. Chapter 1. The Merovingian Family. The Merovingian family, from which the Franks used to choose their kings, is commonly said to have lasted until the time of Childeric III, 743–752, who was deposed, shaved, and thrust into the cloister by command of the Roman Pontiff Stephen II or III, 752–757. But although, to all outward appearance, it ended with him, it had long since been devoid of vital strength, and conspicuous only from bearing the empty epithet royal, The real power and authority in the kingdom lay in the hands of the chief officer of the court, the so-called mayor of the palace, and he was at the head of affairs. There was nothing left the king to do but to be content with his name of king, his flowing hair and long beard, to sit on his throne and play the ruler, to give ear to the ambassadors that came from all quarters, and to dismiss them, as if on his own responsibility, in words that were, in fact, suggested to him, or even imposed upon him. He had nothing that he could call his own beyond this vain title of king, and the precarious support allowed by the mayor of the palace in his discretion, except at a single country seat, that brought him but a very small income. There was a dwelling-house upon this, and a small number of servants attached to it, sufficient to perform the necessary offices. When he had to go abroad, he used to ride in a cart, drawn by a yoke of oxen, driven, peasant fashion, by a ploughman. He rode in this way to the palace and to the general assembly of the people, that met once a year for the welfare of the kingdom, and he returned him in like manner. The mayor of the palace took charge of the government, and of everything that had to be planned or executed at home or abroad. Chapter 2. Charlemagne's ancestors. At the time of Childeric's deposition, Pepin, the father of King Charles, held this office of mayor of the palace, one might almost say, by hereditary right, for Pepin's father, Charles Martel, 1715–1741, had received it at the hands of his father, Pepin, and filled it with distinction. It was this Charles that crushed the tyrants who claimed to rule the whole Frank land as their own, and that utterly routed the Saracens when they attempted the conquest of Gaul, in two great battles, one in Aquitania, near the town of Poitiers, and the other on the river Ber, near Narbonne, and compelled them to return to Spain. This honor was usually conferred by the people only upon men eminent from their illustrious birth and ample wealth. For some years, ostensibly under King, the father of King Charles, Childeric, Pepin shared the duties inherited from his father and grandfather most amicably with his brother, Charlemagne. The latter, then, for reasons unknown, renounced the heavy cares of an earthly crown and retired to Rome, 747. Here he exchanged his worldly garb for a cowl, and built a monastery on Mount Oreste, near the church of St. Sylvester, where he enjoyed for several years the seclusion that he desired, in company with certain others who had the same object in view. But so many distinguished Franks made the pilgrimage to Rome to fulfill their vows, and insisted upon paying their respects to him as their former lord on the way, that the repose which he so much loved was broken by these frequent visits, and he was driven to change his abode. Accordingly, when he found that his plans were frustrated by his many visitors, he abandoned the mountain and withdrew to the monastery of St. Benedict, on Monte Cassino, in the province of Samnium, in 754, and passed the rest there in the exercise of religion. Chapter 3. Charlemagne's accession. Pepin, however, was raised by decree of the Roman pontiff, from the rank of mayor of the palace to that of king, and ruled alone over the Franks for 15 years or more, 752–768. He died of dropsy, September 24, 768, in Paris at the close of the Aquitanian War, which he had waged with William, Duke of Aquitania, for 9 successive years, and left his two sons, Charles and Charlemagne, upon whom, by the grace of God, the succession devolved. The Franks, in general assembly of the people, made them both kings, October 9, 786, on condition that they should divide the whole kingdom equally between them, Charles to take and rule the part that had belonged to their father Pepin, and Charlemagne the part which their uncle Charlemagne had governed. The conditions were accepted, and each entered into the possession of the share of the kingdom that fell to him by this arrangement, but peace was only maintained between them with the greatest difficulty, because many of Charlemagne's party kept trying to disturb their good understanding, and there were some even to plotted to involve them in a war with each other. The event, however, which showed the danger to have been rather imaginary than real, for at Charlemagne's death his widow, Gerberga, fled to Italy with her sons and her principal inheritance, and without reason, despite her husband's brother, put herself and her children under the protection of Desiderius, king of the Lombards. Charlemagne had succumbed to disease after ruling 2 years, in fact, more than 3, in common with his brother, and at his death Charles was unanimously elected King of the Franks. Chapter 4. Plan of this work. It would be folly, I think, to write a word concerning Charles's birth and infancy, or even his boyhood, for nothing has ever been written on the subject, and there is no one alive now who can give information on it. Accordingly, I determined to pass that by as unknown, and to proceed at once to treat of his character, his deed, and such other facts of his life as are worth telling and setting forth, and shall give first an account of his deed at home and abroad, then of his character and pursuits, and lastly of his administration and death, omitting nothing worth knowing or necessary to know. Chapter 5. Aquitanian War. His first undertaking in a military way was the Aquitanian War, begun by his father but not brought to a close, and because he thought that it could be readily carried through, he took it up while his brother was yet alive, calling upon him to render aid. The campaign once opened, he conducted it with the greatest vigor, notwithstanding his brother withheld the assistance that he had promised, and did not desist or shrink from his self-imposed task until, by his patience and firmness, he had completely gained his ends. He compelled Hunold, who had attempted to seize Aquitania after Wayfar's death, and to renew the war then almost concluded, to abandon Aquitania and flee to Gascony. Even here he gave him no rest, but crossed the river Garonne, built the castle of Fronsac, and sent ambassadors to Lupus, Duke of Gascony, to demand the surrender of the fugitive, threatening to take him by force unless he were promptly given up to him. Therefore Lupus chose the wiser course, and not only gave Hunold up, but submitted himself, with the province which he ruled, to the king. End of Preface through Chapter 5.